They put me at a small, wobbly table in the back corner of the grand ballroom, right next to the swinging doors of the kitchen. My sister, Tatum, the bride, floated past in a cloud of white lace and smug satisfaction, leaning down just long enough to whisper, "Don't worry, Cora. We saved the scraps for you." That was the moment the humiliation was supposed to be complete. But the real betrayal wasn't the table, or the whispers, or even the years of being called the family failure. It was the knowledge that every crystal glass they were clinking, every expensive flower they were sniffing, every bite of gourmet food they were swallowing, was all on my dime. Have you ever had to smile while the people who tried to break you celebrated on your generosity? This isn't just a story about a wedding. This is the story of how I bought my revenge and paid for it in cash. The ballroom at the Azure Crest was designed to make you feel small. The ceiling soared 3 stories high, dripping with crystal chandeliers that looked like frozen waterfalls. Every table was draped in heavy silk, centered with a towering arrangement of white orchids and hydrangeas that probably cost more than my first car. A string quartet played softly near the dance floor, their music a tasteful, expensive murmur beneath the chatter of guests. My family, the Maxwells, were at the head table on a raised dais, bathed in a warm, golden spotlight. My father, Preston, sat in the center, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his posture radiating an unearned sense of monarchical authority. Beside him, my mother, Lydia, played the part of the perfect queen, smiling graciously at the sea of faces, her diamond necklace catching the light. They were masters of this universe, a world of performative wealth and unspoken judgments. And then there was me. At table 23. It wasn't just in the back, it was behind the back, tucked into an alcove behind a massive marble pillar. It felt less like a guest table and more like a punishment. The tablecloth was slightly stained. The centerpiece was a single sad-looking rose in a bud vase. And my name card, unlike the elegant telegraphed cards on every other table, was a folded piece of plain white paper with Cora scrawled on it in blue pen. An afterthought. A clear message. Distant cousins and my parents' business acquaintances would walk past, their eyes scanning the room, and their gaze would briefly land on me. I saw the flicker of recognition, followed immediately by a carefully constructed mask of pity. They knew who I was. I was the other Maxwell daughter, the failure, the one who didn't fit, Griffin Prescott's parents, a severe-looking couple who seemed to be carved from the same stone as my own, swept by without a single glance in my direction. To them I didn't even exist. Every few minutes the kitchen doors would swing open, with a violent whoosh, blasting me with a wave of hot air, the smell of garlic, and the frantic shouts of the chefs. It was a constant, percussive reminder of my place. I was literally with the help. When Tatum came over, her white dress, a shimmering beacon of her triumph, I had already steeled myself. She didn't come to welcome me. She came to inspect the wound she had inflicted. Her smile was pure, condescending poison. "We saved the scraps for you," she'd whispered, her voice a sickly sweet confection. I looked up into her perfectly made-up face, at the eyes that held no warmth, only a cold, competitive fire. For a split second I wanted to say something. I wanted to tell her that the scraps she was so proud of me eating were from a feast I had personally laid out for her. But I didn't. I just held her gaze, kept my expression as blank as a sheet of paper, and gave her a small, simple nod. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second, confused by my lack of reaction. That tiny moment of her confusion was the first small victory of the night. Because this wasn't the beginning of my humiliation. This was the end of a long, calculated plan. This whole glittering, fraudulent spectacle was the final scene of a play I had been writing for 2 years. The real story, the one that led to this moment, started on a much colder night. It was Christmas, 2 years ago. The setting was my parents' mansion, the fire roaring in the hearth, the tree glittering with a generation of ornaments. The whole extended family was there. My artisanal candle business, my first real attempt at independence, had just collapsed. I'd poured my savings, my heart, everything into it, and it had failed. I was broke and defeated. During a lull in the conversation after dinner, my father, Preston, stood up, tapping his wine glass for attention. He didn't look at me. He addressed the room, his voice booming with authority. As some of you know, he began, my daughter Cora has been pursuing a hobby, a little candle-making venture. The word hobby was laced with contempt. Unfortunately, as I predicted, it has failed, and in doing so, it has become a drain on this family's resources. The room went silent. I could feel every eye on me. I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. So I am making a public announcement, he continued, his gaze finally finding me, cold and hard. As of tonight, Cora is cut off. No more loans, no more support. She is a hobbyist playing at business, a guaranteed failure. And I will not have the Maxwell name associated with her next inevitable disaster. He wasn't done. He turned his gaze to my aunts, my uncles, my brother Leo. And that goes for all of you. No one is to help her. She needs to learn what the real world is. She needs to fail on her own. That night became infamous in our family lore. It was the night Preston Maxwell publicly disowned his own daughter. He didn't just cast me out, he turned my failure into a public hanging, a warning to anyone else who dared to step out of line. I sat there, paralyzed by shame, as my mother nodded in silent agreement, her expression one of stern disappointment. I looked at my brother Leo, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at his hands, his knuckles white. That was the night I stopped crying. The humiliation was so absolute, so profound, that it burned away all the sadness and left something hard and sharp in its place. As my father sat down to a round of sympathetic murmurs from his sycophants, I made a silent, unbreakable promise to the reflection of the broken girl I saw in the darkened window pane. I wouldn't just survive, I would conquer. And one day, they would all be reminded of this night. After that infamous Christmas dinner, the world became very small and very cold. My father's decree wasn't just words, it was a wall built around me. I was completely, utterly on my own. The first few weeks were a blur of panic. The eviction notice on my small apartment door felt like a physical blow, the red letters screaming at me every time I came home. My landlord, who had always been so friendly when he knew I was a Maxwell, suddenly became a cold, impatient voice on the phone. I don't care who your father is, he'd said. Rent is due on the 1st. I lived on a diet of instant noodles and canned beans, the kind of food I used to donate to food drives without a second thought. Hunger became a constant, dull ache in my stomach. I sold my car for a fraction of its worth. The transaction happening in a sterile office, with a man who could smell my desperation. The hardest thing to let go of was a delicate gold locket my grandmother had given me. It was the last piece of her I had left. I remember standing in the dim, dusty light of a pawn shop, the owner peering at the locket through a jeweler's loupe. My own reflection distorted in the glass case, filled with other people's lost dreams. He offered me $200. I took it without arguing, my throat too tight to speak. That money paid for another month's rent. The shame was a heavy cloak I couldn't take off. I avoided places where I might run into people I knew. The city that was once my playground became a hostile landscape. Every fancy restaurant, every boutique I passed, felt like a monument to the life I had lost. To survive, I had to swallow my pride whole. I took the first job I could get, a server for a high-end catering company. The irony was almost too much to bear. Nights were spent carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres to people who looked just like my parents' friends, people who discussed their summer trips to Europe and the trouble with finding good help. I'd avert my eyes, my face a polite, neutral mask, praying no one would recognize me. Being invisible became my most valuable skill. The work was grueling, my feet throbbing after a 10-hour shift, my back aching from carrying heavy trays. But it paid the bills, Barely. My brother, Leo, was the only one who still called. He was the enabler, the compromised coward of the family. I loved him, but I knew he was trapped. His entire future, his job at my father's real estate firm, his inheritance, his place in the family, was contingent on his absolute loyalty to our father. Our phone calls were an exercise in carefully worded misery. "Hey, Cora, just checking in," he'd say, his voice always low, as if he were afraid of being overheard. "I'm fine, Leo," I'd reply, my tone flat. Are you managing? Do you need anything?" The question was a lie. He knew my father's rule. He couldn't offer me anything. Not really. He was just trying to soothe his own conscience. "I'm managing," I'd say again. I never told him about the eviction notice, or the pawn shop, or the nights I went to bed hungry. I knew anything I said would be reported back to our parents, filtered through his guilt and their judgment. They weren't asking because they cared. They were asking to confirm that I was suffering, that my father's lesson was taking hold. So I gave them nothing. My struggle was my own. It was the one thing they couldn't control or take credit for. This period of my life, as bleak as it was, forged something new in me. It stripped away all the soft, unnecessary parts of my personality. The desire for approval, the fear of judgment, the need for their validation, it all burned away. Humiliation was no longer my biggest fear. It was my baseline. I woke up with it. I went to work with it. I fell asleep with it. And when you live with something every day, it loses its power. It stops being a weapon someone can use against you, and starts being something else entirely. It becomes fuel. Every pitying look I got, every time I had to count my change to buy a loaf of bread, every hollow phone call from my brother, it all went into the furnace, and what came out was a cold, hard, diamond-sharp resolve. They wanted me to learn what the real world was like. Fine, I would. And then I would own it. The idea didn't arrive in a flash of lightning. It was born in the chaos of my catering job, pieced together from 100 different frustrations. The world of high-end events, which looks so seamless and elegant from the outside, was a logistical nightmare behind the scenes. I saw it every night. I'd watch the event planners, their faces tight with stress, speaking into their headsets, trying to juggle a dozen different vendors at once. There was no central nervous system, just a tangle of emails, text messages, and frantic phone calls. I saw a florist deliver thousands of dollars worth of pale pink roses when the bride's color scheme was crimson red. I saw a catering manager realize, an hour before dinner, that the gluten-free meals for a dozen guests had never been ordered. I saw a lighting technician spend 45 minutes on the phone with his boss, trying to figure out why the schematics he was given didn't match the ballroom's layout. Each mistake was a cascade of failures, a domino effect of poor communication that cost time, money, and sanity. The client saw a beautiful party. I saw 1,000 things that almost went wrong, held together by sheer willpower and duct tape. The turning point came during a wedding at a historic hotel downtown. It was a massive, complicated event. The band, a famous jazz ensemble flown in from New Orleans, was the centerpiece of the reception, but the event planner had given them the wrong set times in an email 2 weeks prior, and no one had ever confirmed the change. The band thought they were playing a 90-minute set, starting at 9 p.m. The planner had them on the schedule for 2 45-minute sets, starting at 8 p.m. The argument that ensued was epic. It happened in a service corridor, right next to the industrial dishwashers. The planner was close to tears, the bandleader was red-faced and furious, and the hotel manager was trying to mediate. I was standing nearby, refilling a water pitcher, and I just watched them. They were all looking at different pieces of paper, an old email printout, a handwritten schedule, a formal contract. They had no single source of truth. And that's when it hit me. It was such a simple, obvious idea. What if they did? What if there was a single, centralized platform where every vendor, from the planner to the hotel to the band to the caterer, could see the exact same information in real time, a cloud-based dashboard where the master schedule, the floor plans, the guest list with dietary restrictions, the contact sheets, every single critical detail was updated instantly for everyone. No more conflicting emails, no more lost text messages, just one plan, one version of the truth. That night, after my shift, I didn't go home to my cold apartment. I went to a 24-hour diner, ordered a coffee I couldn't really afford, and took out a stack of napkins. I started sketching. I drew boxes and arrows, mapping out a user interface. I scribbled down features, real-time notifications, a shared calendar, inventory tracking for rentals, a direct messaging system between vendors. I wasn't just doodling, I was architecting a solution. I named it Nexus Events, because it would be the central point connecting all the moving parts. That napkin sketch became my obsession. My days off were no longer for resting my aching feet. I spent them at the public library. The free Wi-Fi, my greatest resource. I devoured everything I could find about software as a service, or SaaS, business models. I read about logistics management, user experience design, and how to write a compelling business plan. I learned about seed funding, angel investors, and venture capital. I was no longer Cora Maxwell, the failed candle maker. I was a student, a researcher, an architect. For 3 months, I worked on the business plan. It was the most rigorous, detailed thing I had ever created. I outlined the market need, the competitive landscape, the technology stack, the subscription-based pricing model, and a 5-year financial projection. I wasn't dreaming anymore. I was building a blueprint for my own salvation, one meticulously researched page at a time. The memory of my father's voice calling me a hobbyist echoed in my head with every word I typed. This was no hobby. This was a brilliant business plan is worthless without capital. I knew this was the next great wall I had to climb. My personal finances were a joke. I barely had enough money for groceries, let alone enough to hire software developers. I needed an investor. Armed with my polished business plan, I started my search. I compiled a list of local angel investors and small private equity groups. The process was a new kind of brutal. Most of my emails went unanswered. The few who did reply sent back polite, form letter rejections. A handful agreed to meet me, usually for a quick 10-minute coffee. They were almost always men in expensive suits who looked at me with a mixture of skepticism and paternalistic amusement. A former candle maker with a software idea. They were polite, but their eyes glazed over as I explained my concept. I was rejected a dozen times. Each no was a fresh sting, but the thick skin I'd grown over the past year served me well. I'd thank them for their time, walk out with my head held high, and add their name to my wrong list. After the 12th rejection, I was close to despair. I had one last meeting on my list. It was with a small, quiet firm called Blackwood Equity, and more specifically, with its semi-retired founder, Gideon Shaw. Gideon Shaw was a legend, and a cautionary tale in the tech industry. He was a brilliant, self-made programmer who had built a revolutionary database software company from his garage in the 90s. But at the height of his success, he'd been the victim of a vicious boardroom coup orchestrated by the very mentee he had personally groomed to be his successor. He lost control of the company he had created. He walked away with millions, but he had lost his legacy. They said the experience had made him bitter, ruthless, and incredibly sharp. He was my last hope. Our meeting took place in his office, a stark, minimalist space with a panoramic view of the city. Gideon Shaw was not what I expected. He was a thin man in his late 60s, with piercing blue eyes and an air of intense, coiled energy. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "You have 15 minutes, he said, his voice a low gravel. "Begin." I launched into my pitch. I didn't talk about my family or my past failures. I talked about the market inefficiency I had witnessed firsthand. I talked about the logistical chaos, the financial waste, and the stress on personnel. I laid out the solution. Nexus events. I walked him through my business plan. The technology, the subscription model, the scalability. He didn't interrupt me once. He just listened, his steepled fingers resting on his chin, his eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, the silence in the room was heavy. "You worked as a cater waiter?" he asked, his first question. "A server for a catering company, yes," I corrected him gently. "And you saw these problems yourself?" "Every single shift." He leaned forward, picking up my business plan. He flipped through it, not reading, but as if testing its weight. "Your financials are aggressive, but plausible. Your market analysis is sound. You've identified a genuine pain point." He paused, and his gaze sharpened. "Why you? You make candles. Now you want to run a tech company. The world is full of people with ideas. Why should I bet on you?" This was the moment. I took a breath. "Because I have nothing to lose," I said, my voice steady. "And because the people who have everything to lose are the ones who are too afraid to see a problem that's right in front of them. You, of all people, should understand what it feels like to have something you built taken away. I'm not just building a company, Mr. Shaw. I'm taking my life back. I will not fail." I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Recognition. He understood the language of betrayal. He understood fire. He stared at me for a long, silent minute. It felt like an eternity. "Nexus events," he said, testing the name on his tongue. He nodded slowly. "All right, Ms. Maxwell. I'll provide your seed funding." A wave of relief, so powerful it almost made me dizzy, washed over me. I opened my mouth to thank him, but he held up a hand. "Let's be very clear," he said, his voice turning to ice. "This is not charity. I'm not your friend. I'm not your father figure. I am your investor. I see talent, and more importantly, I see a hunger that can't be faked. I expect a return, a significant one. Don't make me regret this." His mentorship was never warm. It was brutally honest, relentlessly demanding, and exactly what I needed. He wasn't there to hold my hand. He was there to make sure I won. Gideon's investment was a lifeline, but it was also a ticking clock. The moment the funds hit my new business account, the grind began. I walked away from the catering company without a backward glance and poured every ounce of my being into Nexus events. My life shrank to the four walls of a tiny studio apartment in the least fashionable part of the city. It was little more than a mattress on the floor, a folding card table for a desk, and a coffee machine that was perpetually on. This tiny space became the headquarters of my secret empire. The first order of business was to build the actual product. I used a platform for freelance professionals to find my team. I spent days vetting candidates, looking for people who were not only skilled, but also hungry and willing to take a chance on a new startup. I hired 2 freelance coders, one in Eastern Europe and one in Southeast Asia, and a brilliant user interface designer from Brazil. Our team meetings were a chaotic dance across time zones, conducted over crackly video calls at all hours of the day and night. My days became a relentless cycle of work. I'd wake up at 5 a.m. to sync with my European developer, spend the day managing the project, drafting technical specifications, and planning our go-to-market strategy. My evenings were spent on calls with the designer in Brazil, and I'd often be up until 2 or 3 a.m. conferring with my developer in Asia. Sleep became a luxury. Coffee became a food group. I lived and breathed Nexus events. The walls of my apartment were covered in sticky notes, flowcharts, and wireframe diagrams. I learned to code basic front-end modifications myself, just to speed things up. I was the CEO, the project manager, the quality assurance tester, and the janitor, all rolled into one. Gideon was a constant, demanding presence. He wasn't a micromanager, but his check-ins were intense. He'd call at random times, asking pointed questions that forced me to defend every decision. What's your user acquisition cost? What's the churn rate on the beta testers? Why did you choose this database architecture over that one? He was teaching me to think like a CEO, to be 10 steps ahead, to have an answer for everything. He pushed me to secure the patents for our proprietary scheduling algorithm early on, a move that would prove invaluable later. His mentorship was a trial by fire. All of this was happening in complete secrecy. As far as my family was concerned, I had fallen off the face of the earth. I was just struggling Cora, the girl who couldn't hold down a real job. The isolation was profound. There were days when the only human voice I heard was a cashier's or a developer's on a fuzzy connection. The loneliness was a physical weight, but it was also a shield. In my tiny apartment, I was safe from their judgment. I was free to build. The day we landed our first paying client was a victory I'll never forget. It was a small boutique wedding planner who was tired of managing her events with a mess of spreadsheets and Google Docs. She signed up for our most basic monthly plan. The revenue was barely enough to cover a week's worth of coffee, but it wasn't about the money. It was proof. Someone was willing to pay for what I had built. I remember sitting on the floor of my apartment, looking at the payment confirmation email on my laptop screen, and just crying, not from sadness, but from a bone-deep, soul-shaking sense of accomplishment. A few weeks later, my mother, Lydia, called. Her voice was a carefully crafted blend of maternal concern and condescension. "Cora, darling," she began, "I have the most wonderful news. Tatum is engaged to Griffin Prescott. You remember the Prescotts, of course. A wonderful family." I murmured my congratulations, my heart rate steady. "We're all just thrilled," she continued, "though of course, planning a wedding is a tremendous undertaking. We want to do it right, to maintain the family's reputation." There was a delicate pause. "I know things are difficult for you right now, dear. Don't you worry about a big, expensive gift. We'll understand." Her words were meant to be a kindness, but they were coated in the poison of low expectations. She was reminding me of my place, the poor relation who couldn't be expected to contribute. The old me would have been stung by the casual cruelty of it. The new me saw it for what it was, a move in a game I was no longer playing by their rules. I took a slow breath, looking around at the empire I was building in the shadows, an empire she couldn't even begin to imagine. "That's thoughtful of you, Mom," I said, my voice calm and even. "Don't worry, I'll figure something out." Nexus events began to grow. The first small client led to a few more. Word of mouth in the tight-knit event planning community was a powerful thing. Planners started talking about this new tool that was saving them hours of work and preventing costly mistakes. Our user base grew steadily, from a dozen to 50, then to over 100. We were still small, a guppy in an ocean of sharks. But we were making waves, and one of those sharks noticed. They were called Event Corp, a massive, slow-moving, publicly traded company that had dominated the industry for decades with their clunky, outdated software. They were the Goliath to my David. One afternoon, I received an email from their vice president of acquisitions. He wanted to schedule a call. My heart hammered in my chest as I dialed the number Gideon had given me. "Event Corp wants to talk," I said, my voice tight. "I expected they would," Gideon replied, his tone unruffled. "They're lazy. They don't innovate. They acquire. Hear them out." The call was surreal. The VP, a man whose voice oozed corporate smoothness, showered me with praise for my disruptive little platform. Then he got to the point. They wanted to buy Nexus events. They wanted to absorb my technology and my user base into their behemoth, effectively erasing my company from existence. And they were offering me a life-changing amount of money to do it. The number he quoted made my head spin. It was more money than I had ever imagined seeing in my life. It was enough to live comfortably, luxuriously even, forever. It was the easy way out. I could take the money, prove to my family that I wasn't a failure, and walk away from all the stress, the 18-hour days, the crushing responsibility. The temptation was immense. For a dizzying moment I saw it all. A beautiful apartment, a new car, the freedom to travel, the ability to walk into any store and buy whatever I wanted. I could finally breathe. I went to Gideon's office, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. I laid the offer out on his desk. He looked at the number, then looked at me. He didn't seem impressed. "It's a good offer," he said quietly. "You could take it. No one would blame you. You'd be set for life." "But?" I asked, knowing there was a but. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "Years ago," he began, "when my old company was just starting out, a much bigger rival offered to license my core technology. It was a fortune, more money than a kid from my neighborhood had ever dreamed of. I almost took it. It was the safe, sensible thing to do." He paused, his eyes meeting mine. "But I realized something. If I took their money, my technology would just become a feature in their product. A bullet point on a sales brochure. I would be a footnote in their history. I wanted to be the history." He gestured to the offer on the desk. "They aren't buying you because they admire you, Cora. They're buying you to kill you. They see you as a threat. You can take their money and let them neutralize that threat. Or you can become the company that makes them a footnote in your history. The choice is yours." I left his office and walked for hours, my phone turned off. I thought about the humiliation of that Christmas dinner. I thought about my father's smug pronouncement of my failure. I thought about Tatum's cruel whispers. Taking this buyout would prove I could make money. My father would have to respect that. On some level. But it would also prove him right. It would prove that I was a hobbyist who built something cute and then sold it to the real players. It wouldn't prove my vision was right. It wouldn't prove that I could build something lasting. The money was a golden cage. It offered security at the cost of victory. The next morning, I emailed the vice president of EventCorp. I thanked him for his generous offer. And I turned it down. I was betting on myself. My rejection of the buyout offer made me a target. EventCorp saw me not as a potential acquisition anymore, but as a genuine competitor. And my family, in their own small, petty way, couldn't stand the idea of me succeeding on my own terms. The two forces converged in a way that almost destroyed me. The rumor mill started, as it always does, with my brother Leo. During one of our strained phone calls, he'd let it slip that he'd heard I was doing something with computers. That was all my father needed. Preston Maxwell was a man who understood power, not through innovation, but through influence and brute force. His network in the city's real estate and hospitality circles was a web of favors owed and pressures that could be applied. He couldn't comprehend my business, but he knew how to crush a smaller one. At the time, Nexus Events was on the verge of our first major breakthrough. We were in the final stages of negotiating a contract with a prestigious regional hotel chain. It would have been a game changer, putting us on the map and quadrupling our revenue overnight. I had spent weeks in meetings, giving demos, and building a relationship with their executive team. The deal was all but signed. Then, suddenly, it went cold. My calls to the CEO, a man who had been incredibly enthusiastic just a week before, went to voicemail. My emails were met with curt, one-sentence replies from his assistant. Finally, I received a formal letter. It stated that, after careful consideration, the board had decided to postpone the modernization of their event logistics. The letter cited concerns about the stability of a new and unproven partner. It was corporate speak for "you're dead to us." I knew with a gut-wrenching certainty that it was my father's doing. The CEO of that hotel chain had several large development projects pending approval from the city's zoning board, a board where my father had friends and immense influence. It wouldn't have taken much, just a quiet word from Preston over a round of golf, a casual mention of his unreliable daughter, and the deal was poisoned. It was a devastating blow. The loss of that contract sent ripples of panic through my small company. We had been counting on that revenue to expand our team and upgrade our infrastructure. Now our financial future was precarious. For a moment, all the progress I had made felt like an illusion. The old despair, the feeling of being small and powerless against my family's monolithic influence, washed over me. It felt like no matter how hard I worked or how smart I was, my father could still reach out and casually swat me down like a fly. That evening, my mother called. Her timing was, as always, impeccable. "Cora, dear," she said, her voice dripping with feigned sympathy. "Leo mentioned you had a little setback with your computer business. I'm so sorry to hear that." I said nothing, just listened to the hum of the line. "You know, darling," she continued, "there's no shame in admitting when something is too much for you. This world of entrepreneurship, it's so aggressive. Maybe it's time to think about a nice, stable office job, something with benefits. Your father and I just worry about you." Every word was a perfectly sharpened dagger, designed to find the heart of my insecurity. She wasn't worried, she was gloating. They had tried to break my business and they thought they had succeeded. They wanted me to give up, to crawl back and admit that they had been right all along. I could feel the walls of their expectations closing in around me. The silence on my end of the line stretched on, and I let it. I let her sit in it, wondering what I was thinking. Finally, I took a slow breath, the cold anger solidifying in my chest. "Thank you for your concern, Mother," I said, my voice devoid of all emotion. "But I have it handled," and I hung up the phone. The despair was gone. All that was left was rage. My father's sabotage was meant to be a killing blow, the final lesson in my place in the world. But he made a critical mistake. He underestimated my rage, and he underestimated Gideon Shaw. When I told Gideon what had happened, I expected him to be disappointed, maybe even to pull his funding. Instead, for the first time, I saw a flicker of something that looked like a predator's smile. "Good," he said, his voice a low growl. "Your father just showed his hand. He thinks he's playing checkers. He has no idea we're playing chess." He poked the bear, Cora. Now let's give the bear a steak. He was right. My father's attack had been personal, emotional. It made me furious, but it also clarified my purpose. I wasn't just fighting for market share anymore. I was fighting a war against the old guard, the gatekeepers who used their influence to stifle innovation and maintain the status quo. My father was the embodiment of that system. Beating him wasn't enough. I had to make him irrelevant. Gideon picked up his phone and made a call. "Get me Marcus Thorne," he said into the receiver, and my jaw nearly hit the floor. Marcus Thorne was the CEO of the Phoenix Hedowick Group, a massive national conglomerate, and the primary rival to the hotel chain my father had influenced. Phoenix was known for being aggressive, innovative, and ruthless. They were the sharks of the industry. "Your father played in the local sandbox," Gideon said, after he hung up. "We're going to the ocean. You have a presentation with their entire executive board in New York. In 3 days." The panic and fury I felt coalesced into a laser-like focus. For the next 72 hours, I didn't sleep. I refined my presentation, polished my data, and prepared for the fight of my life. When I walked into the Phoenix Group's boardroom, I wasn't the nervous startup founder they might have expected. I was a CEO who had been tested by fire, who had faced down sabotage, and walked away stronger. My presentation wasn't just about software. It was a declaration of war on inefficiency. I laid out, in stark detail, the millions of dollars the hospitality industry was losing every year due to logistical errors, poor communication, and outdated systems. I presented Nexus events, not as a simple tool, but as a comprehensive strategic solution, a nervous system for the modern hospitality empire. I showed them how our platform would streamline their operations, reduce their costs, and give them a powerful data-driven advantage over their competitors. When I finished, the room was silent. Marcus Thorne, a man with a reputation for being perpetually unimpressed, looked at me, then at Gideon, then back at me. Your old suitor, he said, referring to the regional chain, is run by dinosaurs. They're afraid of the future. We intend to own it. They didn't just sign a contract. They made an offer that was beyond my wildest dreams. Phoenix Hospitality Group wanted to make Nexus Events their exclusive event logistics platform across their entire portfolio, over 300 luxury properties, resorts, and convention centers nationwide. It wasn't just a deal, it was an anointing. Overnight, my small, struggling company became the new industry standard. The contract came with a capital infusion that made me personally, astronomically wealthy. But the money was secondary. The power was the point. My family, in their bubble of arrogance, remained completely oblivious. They thought they had crushed me. They had no idea they had just handed me the weapon I would use to dismantle their world. I was no longer the girl they had kicked out. I was the CEO of the company that now controlled the operational backbone of their favorite playgrounds. And the irony was, they were about to plan a party right in the heart of my new empire. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday. It was a thick, cream-colored card, heavy with the weight of its own importance. The edges were beveled in gold leaf, the script a swirling, ostentatious display of calligraphy. Mr. and Miss Preston Maxwell request the honor of your presence at the marriage of their daughter, Tatum Elizabeth, to Mr. Griffin Wallace Prescott, and then, the location, the Azure Crest Resort, Grand Ballroom. I laughed out loud when I saw it. A real, genuine laugh. The Azure Crest wasn't just a luxury resort. It was one of the flagship properties of the Phoenix Hospitality Group. It was one of my newest and biggest clients. Every single event held there, from a small corporate lunch to a wedding of this magnitude, was now planned, managed, and executed through my software. Through Nexus Events, they were planning their grand performance of wealth and status on a stage that I owned. The delicious, perfect irony of it was almost too much to comprehend. A week later, just as I knew she would, my mother called. Her voice when she spoke was a masterpiece of manipulation, dripping with a fake, sugary sweetness that set my teeth on edge. "Cora, darling," she cooed. "How are you? We were just thinking of you." A blatant lie. They only thought of me when they needed something, or wanted to remind me of my shortcomings. "I'm fine, Mother," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Well, I'm calling, because, as you know, this wedding is, well, it's become quite the production," she said, with a theatrical sigh. "You know how your father is. He wants everything to be perfect, to maintain the family's reputation. Griffin's family, the Prescotts, they expect a certain standard." I waited, letting her spin her web. "The thing is, darling," she said, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper, "we may have overextended just a tiny bit. The venue, the caterer. It all adds up so quickly. It's a temporary cash flow issue, you understand. Just until a few of your father's deals close." Another lie. I knew from public records that my father's firm had lost 2 major contracts recently. They weren't just overextended, they were in trouble. And then came the punchline. "We were wondering, Cora, if you might be in a position to help. Just a small loan, to cover the main expenses. The venue and the catering. We would, of course, pay you back with interest." I closed my eyes, savoring the moment. It was the ultimate hypocrisy. The family who had publicly disowned me, who had called me a failure and a money pit, who had actively tried to destroy my business, was now coming to me, cap in hand, asking the family failure to bankroll their fantasy. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they couldn't see the absurdity. They still saw me as clueless Cora, the girl they could manipulate. They had no idea they were talking to the CEO, whose platform was managing the very payment they were asking for. This was my moment. The culmination of 2 years of silence, struggle, and relentless work. The revenge wasn't going to be loud or angry. It was going to be transactional. "A loan?" I asked, feigning surprise. "Of course. I think I could manage that. For family." I could almost hear the sigh of relief on the other end of the line. She thought she had me. She thought I was so desperate for their approval that I would jump at the chance to buy my way back in. "Oh, Cora, darling, that's wonderful," she gushed. "Your father will be so pleased." "But," I said, my voice turning crisp and businesslike, "I have some conditions." "Conditions?" Her voice sharpened slightly. "Yes, I don't want to create any family awkwardness. This will be a professional transaction. The payment won't come from me to you. It will be made directly to the Azure Crest's parent company, the Phoenix Group, to settle the account for the event. And to maintain anonymity, all communication must go through the wedding planner." "What's her name?" "Miss Finch," my mother supplied, slightly flustered. "Isabel Finch." "Perfect," I said. "I will have my office wire the funds to cover the venue, catering, and all associated costs upon receipt of the final invoice from Miss Finch. You won't have to worry about a thing." They agreed immediately. They were too desperate and too arrogant to question it. They thought they were playing me, getting a free ride from the daughter they had cast aside. In reality, they had just handed me the microphone and the spotlight for their own public downfall. The trap was set. All I had to do now was wait for the party. The day of the wedding arrived, bright and painfully beautiful. I chose my armor carefully, a simple, elegant sheath dress in a deep sapphire blue. It was custom-made, the fabric exquisite, but its power was in its understatement. In a room filled with sequins and frills, I would be a slash of confident color. I did my own makeup, my hands surprisingly steady. I was calm. This wasn't a performance, it was an execution. I arrived at the Azure Crest alone. As I walked into the grand foyer, the hostess, a young woman with a clipboard and a practiced smile, greeted me. "Name?" she asked. "Cora Maxwell." She ran her finger down the printed guest list. Then she ran it down again. A flicker of panic crossed her face. "I'm so sorry, I don't seem to have you on the main seating chart." "Right on cue." A flustered-looking assistant in a black suit scurried over. "The extra guest," he muttered to the hostess, not quite looking at me. "Table 23. I'll show her." The walk to my table was a masterclass in humiliation theater. He led me through the entire ballroom, past tables of my parents' smiling friends, past curious relatives, all the way to the back, to the small wobbly table next to the swinging kitchen doors. The walk of shame. I could feel my father's eyes on me from the head table, a flicker of cold triumph in his gaze. He had put me in my place. I sat down, smoothed my dress, and took a slow, deliberate sip of water. I surveyed the room, my kingdom. A few minutes later, my sister Tatum made her grand, cruel entrance, delivering her line about the scraps with practiced venom. I gave her the blank nod that so confused her, and she floated away, satisfied. The door next to me swung open, and a waiter nearly collided with my chair. I didn't flinch. I was an island of calm in their carefully constructed storm. Then, my plus one arrived. My plus one was Gideon Shaw. He entered the ballroom and stood for a moment, his presence immediately drawing attention. Gideon had a kind of gravitational pull. He was a known quantity in the worlds of finance and technology. People whispered, wondering what he was doing here. He spotted me, walked directly to my table, and took in the scene. The wobbly legs, the single rows, the proximity to the kitchen. He raised a single eloquent eyebrow, a silent question. I gave a tiny shrug. He pulled out the other chair and sat down without a word. His presence at my forgotten table was a question mark. No one could answer, and it threw a subtle note of chaos into their perfect plan. Throughout the dinner, I watched. I was an observer, a scientist studying a foreign species, and I watched the wedding planner, Miss Isabel Finch. She was the neutral observer, the jury. She was a tall, impeccably dressed woman in her 40s, with a face that betrayed no emotion. She moved through the room with the quiet efficiency of a general, speaking into her earpiece, directing her staff with subtle hand gestures. She was a true professional, and she knew, she had to know, the entire event, every vendor payment, every schedule change, was being run through the Nexus Events platform, my platform. Her company had received the wire transfer for the full amount of the wedding, from my company. She knew who was paying her fee. A few times, her eyes would sweep the room, and for a fraction of a second, her gaze would meet mine across the sea of guests. She would give a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a gesture of collusion, it was one of professional respect. The architect of the event, acknowledging the architect of the system that made it all possible. The stage was set. The audience was seated. The final act was about to begin. The clinking of a spoon against a crystal glass signaled the beginning of the toasts. The lights dimmed slightly, and a spotlight found my father, Preston, as he stood, glass raised. He looked every bit the proud patriarch, the benevolent king of his dynasty. "Friends, family," he began, his voice resonating with practiced confidence. "What a glorious day! To see my beautiful daughter Tatum marry a fine young man like Griffin. It fills a father's heart with pride." He paused, letting the sentiment hang in the air. "When we decided to host this wedding at a venue like the Azure Crest, we did it because a Maxwell and a Prescott deserves nothing but the best. It's about legacy. It's about tradition." He smiled, a wide, self-satisfied grin. "It's about showing the world what can be achieved through hard work, strong family values, and a commitment to excellence." He then turned his gaze in my general direction, a cruel glint in his eye. "True, lasting success, you see, comes from building on a solid foundation. It comes from tradition, not from fleeting fancies or silly little projects that wither and die." The jab was clear. A murmur of sympathetic agreement rippled through the tables of his allies. He was using his daughter's wedding toast to take one last public shot at me. He and my mother beamed as the room broke into applause. He was on top of the world. Next, a few of Griffin's groomsmen gave awkward, rambling toasts, then Tatum's maid of honor. Finally, the MC, a man with a booming voice and a plastic smile, stepped back to the microphone. "And now, folks, let's hear a few words from the true architect of this beautiful evening, the woman who made all this magic happen. Please give a warm round of applause for the incredible Miss Isabel Finch." Another round of polite applause. Miss Finch walked to the microphone with a grace and poise that commanded attention. She adjusted the mic, her calm a stark contrast to the performative emotion of the evening. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice crisp and clear, carrying to every corner of the vast ballroom. "On behalf of the entire staff here at the Azure Crest and the Phoenix Hospitality Group, I want to extend my heartfelt congratulations to Tatum and Griffin. It has been a pleasure to bring your vision to life." She smiled, a professional, warm smile that she directed at the head table. "An event of this magnitude is a massive undertaking. It requires vision, dedication, and of course significant resources to make every detail perfect." My parents preened under her praise. My father puffed out his chest, ready to receive the accolades he felt he was owed. "And tonight," Miss Finch continued, her voice gaining a slight sharp edge of authority, "we must extend our deepest and most sincere gratitude to the person whose quiet generosity made every single detail of this night possible. From the champagne in your glasses, to the thousands of orchids on your tables, to the fee for the string quartet, this entire celebration was made possible by the vision and backing of one individual." A hush fell over the room. You could have heard a pin drop. Every single guest, all 200 of them, turned their eyes to the head table, expecting her to point to my father. Preston himself looked like he was about to burst with pride. He was ready to take his bow. Miss Finch let the silence hang for a beat longer, building the tension to an almost unbearable level. She scanned the room, and for a fleeting second, her eyes met mine. Then she turned her gaze back to the microphone. "So please join me," she said, her voice ringing out, clear and cutting as diamond, "in thanking the sole benefactor of this entire celebration, the founder and CEO of Nexus Events, the very software platform this event was planned and executed on, Miss Cora Maxwell." For a full 3 seconds there was absolute profound silence. It was a silence so deep, it felt like the world had stopped spinning. It was the sound of 200 people processing information that did not compute. It was the sound of a carefully constructed reality shattering into a million pieces. Then, chaos. It started not with a bang, but with the slow, collective swivel of 200 heads, like a flock of birds turning in unison. Every eye in the room pivoted away from the head table and scanned the back of the ballroom, searching, until they landed on the forgotten corner, on the wobbly table by the kitchen doors. On the spotlight operator, confused but following the sudden shift in focus, swung the beam away from my father and swept it across the room until it found me, pinning me in a circle of white light. I didn't have to look at the head table to know what was happening. I could feel it. But I did look. I raised my head and looked directly at my family. My father's face was a horrifying spectacle. The ruddy, confident complexion he'd worn just moments before had vanished, replaced by a ghastly, pale white. The blood had literally drained from his face, leaving behind a slack-jawed mask of disbelief. His mouth was slightly open, as if he were trying to speak but had forgotten how. My mother's reaction was even more dramatic. Her perfectly painted smile was frozen in a rictus of horror, and her jaw had literally dropped open. Her hand, glittering with diamonds, flew to her chest in a gesture of pure, unadulterated shock. She looked as though she'd just seen a ghost. And Tatum, my beautiful, triumphant sister. Her face was a canvas of collapsing emotions. First, confusion, then, dawning comprehension. Then, a wave of incandescent rage, followed by the deepest, most profound humiliation I had ever witnessed. She looked as if I had walked up and slapped her in front of everyone. Her new husband, Griffin, just looked lost, his eyes darting from me to my father, and back again, his simple mind unable to process the social cataclysm unfolding before him. But the most satisfying reaction of all was my brother's. Leo, the enabler, the one who stood by and did nothing. He couldn't look at me, he couldn't look at anyone. He just crumbled, his shoulders slumping, his gaze fixed on his dessert plate as if it held the answers to the universe. His face was a portrait of absolute shame. Then, another sound broke the silence. A slow, deliberate clap. It was Gideon. Sitting beside me, he began to applaud, not loudly, but with a rhythmic, powerful finality. A proud, wolfish grin was spread across his face. He was enjoying the show. Miss Finch, her duty done, gave me a small, respectful nod from the stage. The verdict of the jury had been delivered. Slowly, I pushed my chair back and stood up. The spotlight followed me. I picked up my simple glass of water, the crystal cool against my fingers. I held it up. A toast. I didn't scan the room. I locked eyes directly with my father, holding his shocked, horrified gaze. To family, I said, my voice not loud, but ringing with a perfect, chilling calm that carried across the silent room. May we all get exactly what we deserve. I took a small, delicate sip of water, then placed the glass back on the table with a soft click. I sat down. The silence that followed was even more deafening than the first one. It was the sound of a world breaking. The entire social hierarchy of the room, built on the foundation of my family's perceived power and wealth, had just been publicly and irrevocably dismantled by the one person they had thrown away. The rest of the wedding was a blur of surreal, quiet chaos. No more toasts were made. The band played to a nearly empty dance floor. Guests began to leave early, whispering amongst themselves, their faces a mixture of shock and delicious gossip. They couldn't get out of that room, with its toxic atmosphere of humiliation, fast enough. I didn't stay long. Gideon and I walked out, leaving my family to sit in the ruins of their own making. I didn't look back. A month has passed since the wedding. I'm not on a yacht in the Caribbean or on a lavish vacation. I'm in my office. It's a corner office, yes, with a stunning view of the city. But it's not opulent. It's simple, functional, filled with whiteboards and monitors. A place for work, for building. The revenge is over. The satisfaction I felt in that ballroom was real. A visceral, white-hot thrill. But I've learned that revenge isn't a destination. It's a door. And walking through it, I found not an empty room, but a new beginning. I am on a video call with Gideon. We're not gloating about the past. We're talking about the future. We're finalizing the details of the Nexus Foundation, a new philanthropic initiative I've started. We're funding a scholarship program for young women from underprivileged backgrounds who want to study technology and engineering. We're building ladders for girls who were told they couldn't climb. Gideon, in his own gruff way, is immensely proud. Using your power to create more power, he'd said. That's how you build a real legacy. My phone buzzes on the desk beside me. I glance at the screen. It's the 5th text message from my brother Leo today. They're all the same, a desperate stream of apologies, of excuses, of pleas to talk. I'm so sorry, Cora. I was a coward. Please, just let me explain. I read it, and I feel a pang of something, not anger anymore, but a distant, quiet sadness for the man he could have been. I swipe the notification away and ignore it, just as I've ignored the dozens of voicemails from my mother and the single stiff email from my father's attorney. My victory wasn't about destroying them. I see that now. My victory was about surviving them. It was about building myself into someone they could no longer hurt. True power isn't about making others feel small. It's the quiet, unshakable freedom to choose your own path. It's the ability to define your own family. A family that might include a wounded mentor and the brilliant young women I hope to help, rather than the people who share my blood. It's the freedom to never ever let anyone else decide your worth or where you sit at the table. I end the call with Gideon and turn my chair to face the window. The city sprawls out before me, a vast landscape of lights and possibilities. For the first time in my life, I feel no anger, no bitterness, just a deep, profound sense of peace. I am free. So, what do you think? The ultimate revenge is living a life so successful that your enemies have to ask you for a loan. That's what I believe. Anyway, but I want to know what you would have done. Would you have paid for the wedding just to see the looks on their faces? Or would you have refused and let them face the consequences on their own? Let me know your revenge plan in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of epic comebacks and sweet, sweet karma, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories you won't want to miss. Thanks for listening.